Bobby Mackenzie's weathered hand froze mid-air, the auction paddle trembling as his German Shepherd Atlas suddenly erupted in a low, bone-chilling growl that silenced the entire crowd. It wasn't the 25 cents that shocked everyone at the government surplus auction. It was the fact that nobody else had bid on 47 acres of prime Virginia mountain property. The auctioneer's gavel hung suspended, his face pale as Atlas's hackles rose like spears along his battle-scarred spine. Around them, weathered farmers and land developers who'd come with thick wallets suddenly found urgent reasons to examine their boots, their silence more deafening than any protest. Eleanor Hartwell, the only neighbor brave enough to speak, stepped closer with arthritic hands clutched around her shawl. "Son," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of buried secrets. "Some doors ought to stay closed." The gavel finally fell with a crack that echoed like gunshot through the mountain air. Bobby had just purchased his late wife Margaret's dream cabin, the same cabin that had remained empty for 15 years after its last owner disappeared without a trace. What had he just bought for 25 cents? And why did Atlas look like he'd rather die than set paw on that cursed land? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Bobby Mackenzie had served 2 tours in Vietnam, buried 3 brothers, and held his wife Margaret's hand as cancer took her breath away 3 years ago. But nothing had prepared him for the hollow ache of coming home to silence every evening. At 67, his weathered hand still reached for the coffee pot to make 2 cups each morning, muscle memory refusing to accept that Margaret would never again wrap her arms around his waist and whisper, "Morning, handsome," against his shoulder blade. The government pension of $1,847 stretched thin across the month like butter on day-old bread, barely covering rent on the double-wide trailer that had become his world since Margaret's medical bills devoured their savings. The oncology ward at Richmond General had taken everything, their house, their car, their future, leaving Bobby with nothing but Atlas and a mason jar containing exactly 25 cents, the last remnant of Margaret's dream house fund that she'd contributed to faithfully for 32 years of marriage. Atlas had arrived 6 months after Margaret's funeral, a damaged German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes that held too much knowledge of war and loss. The military adoption coordinator had warned Bobby that the 8-year-old dog came with baggage, PTSD from losing his handler, Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, to an IED explosion in Afghanistan. "He's been through 4 potential homes," the woman explained, shuffling papers with nervous efficiency. "Highly trained, but he doesn't trust easy. Selective bonding, they call it." Bobby had knelt beside the kennel, studying the scarred muzzle and alert ears of a warrior who understood abandonment. "Well, boy," he'd whispered, extending calloused fingers through the chain link, "looks like we're both carrying ghosts." Atlas had approached cautiously, sniffing the scent of grief and recognition before placing his massive head against Bobby's palm, the first human contact he'd accepted since Mike's death. Now they were partners in survival, 2 battle-worn souls sharing canned beans and silent evenings in a trailer that smelled like loneliness and faded memories. Atlas had gradually learned to trust again, following Bobby everywhere with the devotion of a soldier who'd found his new mission. They understood each other's nightmares, the way sudden noises could freeze a man mid-step, the importance of checking corners and exits in any room. Margaret had dreamed of a small cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains where they could watch sunrises together and grow old in peace. She'd clipped pictures from magazines, planned gardens, and saved every spare quarter in that mason jar while fighting her body's betrayal. "Someday, Bobby," she'd say during her final weeks, "we'll have our little place where we can watch the sunrise together." The 25 cents represented 32 years of hope, now reduced to pocket change that couldn't even buy a cup of coffee. When Bobby heard about the government surplus auction, something stirred in his chest, not hope exactly, but perhaps its distant cousin, possibility. Margaret's dream deserved better than dying in a trailer park, even if all he had to offer was everything she'd saved. The September morning air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke as Bobby loaded his rusted pickup truck with everything he owned: 2 duffel bags of clothes, a toolbox older than most marriages, and a cardboard box containing Margaret's photograph, their wedding album, and the empty mason jar that had once held dreams. Atlas paced nervously in the truck bed, his dark eyes scanning the mountain road ahead with the hypervigilance of a soldier who'd learned that danger often wore the mask of beauty. The 47 acres stretched before them like something from Margaret's magazine clippings: rolling meadows dotted with wildflowers, a creek that sang over smooth stones, and towering oaks that had witnessed generations of human folly. The cabin itself sat in a natural clearing, its cedar logs weathered silver by decades of mountain storms. The wraparound porch inviting despite the broken rocking chair that swayed in the breeze like a ghost seeking comfort. Atlas jumped down from the truck and immediately began pacing the perimeter, nose to the ground, every muscle taut with alertness. His behavior struck Bobby as odd. Not the cautious exploration of new territory, but the systematic reconnaissance of a battlefield. The dog's ears rotated like radar dishes, tracking sounds that human ears couldn't detect, his tail held low and rigid in a way that made Bobby's Vietnam-trained instincts prickle with unease. "What's got you spooked, boy?" Bobby murmured, watching as Atlas approached the front porch only to retreat 3 times, circling back with increasing agitation. The dog had faced Taliban fighters without flinching, but something about this peaceful mountain cabin had him rattled to his core. The interior revealed the first contradiction. Despite supposedly being abandoned for 15 years, the cabin showed signs of recent occupancy. No dust covered the simple wooden furniture, no cobwebs draped the corners, and the fieldstone fireplace held cold ashes that smelled of recent fires. Bobby ran his finger along the mantelpiece and came away clean, his soldier's mind cataloging inconsistencies like a detective at a crime scene. A coffee cup sat beside the kitchen sink, still bearing the faint ring of dried liquid. Reading glasses lay folded on a small table near the window, their lenses clean and scratch-free. Most unsettling of all, a delicate perfume bottle caught the afternoon light on the windowsill. Chanel No. 5. The same fragrance Margaret had worn every day of their marriage, the scent that still haunted Bobby's dreams. His hands shook as he lifted the bottle, feeling the weight of liquid inside. Margaret had been buried with her jewelry, her wedding dress, and a photograph of their honeymoon. But somehow her signature perfume had found its way to a cabin she'd never seen, in mountains she'd never visited, 40 miles from where she'd drawn her last breath. Atlas whined from the doorway, refusing to cross the threshold despite Bobby's encouragement. The dog's distress seemed focused on a specific area near the fireplace where his trained nose detected something that made him pace and paw at the floorboards with increasing urgency. The anomaly became clear when Bobby knelt to examine the hardwood floor. A 3-by-3-foot section had been cut and professionally resealed, the edges so tight they were nearly invisible until viewed from the correct angle. Someone with military-grade construction skills had opened this floor and sealed it again, using techniques Bobby recognized from classified operations in Southeast Asia. Margaret's toolbox sat in the bedroom closet, her initials still visible on the worn leather handle. Inside, Bobby found the specialized pry bars and cutting tools that would be needed to open sealed floorboards, along with work gloves that still held the faint scent of her hand cream. The implications crashed over him like a mountain avalanche. Margaret had not only visited this cabin, she had worked here, planned here, left pieces of herself in a place he'd never known existed. The sound of approaching footsteps on the porch interrupted his racing thoughts. Atlas erupted in warning barks. positioning himself between Bobby and the door with military precision. Through the window, Bobby glimpsed a figure approaching. An elderly woman with silver hair and a determined stride, carrying what appeared to be a covered casserole dish. Eleanor Hartwell knocked with the confidence of someone who'd walked these mountains for 7 decades, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd buried husbands and raised children through hard times. "Bobby McKenzie, I know you're in there, and I know you've got questions that need answering. I've got apple pie and some truths that might be harder to swallow." Atlas's growls softened to worried whimpers as Bobby opened the door. Eleanor's eyes immediately went to the German shepherd, her expression shifting from neighborly concern to something deeper, recognition mixed with profound sadness. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, staring at Atlas. "You're the one she told me about, the one who's been carrying her secrets all this time." Eleanor Hartwell stepped into the cabin with the familiarity of someone who'd walked these floors before, her weathered hands setting the covered dish on the simple wooden table as if she'd done so countless times. Atlas retreated to the corner but remained alert, his intelligent eyes tracking every movement while his body language shifted from aggressive to cautiously protective. "Your wife came to see me 6 times before she died," Eleanor said without preamble, settling into one of the wooden chairs with a sigh that spoke of old bones and older secrets. "Smart woman, your Margaret. Asked all the right questions, took all the right precautions. She knew this place held answers, but she also knew it held dangers." Bobby remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides as conflicting emotions warred across his weathered face. Margaret never mentioned knowing anyone in these mountains. She was fighting cancer, spending every day at treatments or sleeping off the chemotherapy. When would she have had time to drive up here? "Those Wednesday appointments she told you were extra treatments?" Eleanor's eyes held the gentle firmness of someone delivering necessary medicine. "She was driving up here instead, working on something she said would matter more than her life. Said she had promises to keep and debts to pay, and not much time to do either." The revelation hit Bobby like shrapnel, sharp and unexpected. Margaret's Wednesday absences had troubled him, but her explanation about experimental treatments had seemed plausible given her desperate fight against the disease. He'd driven her to appointments on Mondays and Fridays, held her hand through the nausea and exhaustion, never questioning why she insisted on going alone on Wednesdays. Atlas whined softly and moved closer to Bobby, sensing his emotional distress with the precision of a therapy animal trained to recognize human suffering. The dog's presence grounded Bobby, reminding him that loyalty could exist even when trust felt shattered. "What kind of work?" Bobby's voice came out rougher than intended, decades of cigarettes and mountain air scraping against his vocal cords. What could possibly be more important than fighting for her life? Eleanor's expression grew distant, her gaze drifting toward the sealed section of floor. Fighting for other lives. Margaret discovered that good soldiers, both human and canine, were being used for purposes that would make the devil himself weep. She couldn't let it continue, even if stopping it cost her everything. "You're talking in riddles, Eleanor." "My wife was a secretary at the courthouse, not some kind of investigator. She filed papers and answered phones for 28 years until the cancer made her too weak to work." "Your wife was a lot of things you never knew about," Eleanor said gently. "Before she married you, before she settled into that courthouse job, Margaret was a military journalist. Did 2 tours documenting conditions for service members overseas, 1 commendations for exposing corruption in supply chains that were getting soldiers killed." Bobby sank into the remaining chair, feeling the solid wood beneath him as the only constant in a world that had suddenly shifted on its axis. Margaret had never spoken of military service, had no uniforms in their closet, displayed no medals or commendations. Their entire marriage felt like it was built on foundations he'd never known existed. "She kept that life buried for good reasons," Eleanor continued. made enemies of powerful people who preferred their crimes stay hidden. When she married you, she thought she'd left all that behind. But some fights follow you home, Bobby, especially when innocent lives are at stake. Atlas moved to the sealed floor section and began pawing at the edges, his behavior more insistent than before. The dog's training and explosive detection had taught him to identify sealed containers and hidden compartments, skills that apparently extended to modified floorboards and concealed evidence. "What's down there?" Bobby asked, watching as Atlas continued his systematic investigation of the sealed area. "What did Margaret hide that was worth dying for?" "Proof," Eleanor said simply. "Documentation of experiments being conducted on military working dogs, using them as test subjects for enhancement drugs that drove them insane. Your Atlas there was supposed to be one of the subjects, but Margaret got him transferred out of the program before they could destroy his mind." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Bobby stared at Atlas, seeing the scars along his muzzle and legs with new understanding. Not all battle wounds came from enemy fire. Some came from the people who were supposed to protect those who served. "She saved him?" Bobby's voice cracked with the weight of revelation. "Atlas belonged to Margaret before he came to me?" "Belonged isn't the right word," Eleanor corrected. "Margaret was Atlas's handler during her final tour overseas. When she discovered what they planned to do to him and dozens of other dogs, she used her connections to get them reassigned or retired. Atlas came to you because she asked him to watch over you when she couldn't." Bobby looked at the German Shepherd with new eyes, seeing not just a damaged veteran seeking companionship, but a loyal soldier carrying out his final mission from the woman who'd saved his life. The dog's behavior at the auction, his protective instincts, his refusal to leave Bobby's side, all of it stemmed from a promise made to a dying handler who'd loved them both. The sealed floor contains evidence that could destroy military careers and expose a network of corruption that reaches into the highest levels of government, Eleanor explained. Margaret spent her last months gathering documentation, building an airtight case. She sealed it here because she knew they'd come for it eventually, and she wanted it protected by someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. "Someone like me," Bobby said, understanding beginning to dawn. "She knew I'd find this place somehow." Eleanor smiled, the first warmth she'd shown since arriving. "She knew Atlas would lead you here when the time was right. That dog's been waiting 3 years to complete his mission. The question now is whether you're ready to help him finish what Margaret started." The following week passed in a blur of discoveries that shattered everything Bobby thought he knew about his wife and his life. Each morning he woke before dawn to find Atlas already positioned by the sealed floorboards, the dog's vigil as faithful as a sentry guarding classified intelligence. The German Shepherd had begun refusing walks that took them away from the cabin, his protective instincts laser-focused on the hidden evidence beneath their feet. Eleanor's daily visits became Bobby's lifeline to sanity as she gradually revealed the scope of Margaret's secret investigation. The elderly woman possessed a steel-trap memory for details and dates, having served as Margaret's confidant during those final months when the cancer was eating away at her body while determination consumed her soul. She started having suspicions about military dog treatments after reading Atlas's medical records, Eleanor explained during one of their afternoon conversations on the cabin's porch. Standard PTSD therapy doesn't require experimental drug cocktails, and it certainly doesn't explain why so many decorated service dogs were being euthanized for behavioral issues shortly after their handlers died. Bobby had found Margaret's hidden laptop in the root cellar, powered by a solar battery system he hadn't known existed. The password had taken him 3 days to crack until Atlas, in a moment of apparent inspiration, had pawed at a framed photograph of the dog wearing his military service tags. The 6-digit number engraved on Atlas's identification tag unlocked a digital treasure trove of corruption that made Bobby's Vietnam-era exposure to military incompetence seem like innocent mistakes. The files contained medical records for over 200 military working dogs spanning 5 years, each document painting a picture of systematic abuse disguised as scientific advancement. Dogs that had served with distinction were being injected with experimental compounds designed to enhance aggression and eliminate fear responses, turning loyal companions into unpredictable weapons. When the treatments inevitably caused psychological breakdowns, the animals were quietly destroyed, and their handlers told they died from complications related to combat stress. Margaret's journalistic instincts had led her to interview families of handlers whose dogs had died under suspicious circumstances. Bobby read transcripts of conversations with grieving soldiers who described radical personality changes in their canine partners, beloved pets becoming aggressive strangers before disappearing into military medical facilities and never returning. The families had been given standard condolences and minimal death benefits, their questions dismissed as emotional overreactions to wartime loss. Atlas's file painted the most devastating picture. The dog had been slated for Project Silent Guardian, a program designed to create super soldiers capable of operating without human oversight in hostile territory. The enhancement drugs would have destroyed his capacity for normal bonding while amplifying his killer instincts until he became a four-legged weapon incapable of distinguishing friend from foe. Margaret had discovered the project 3 days before Atlas was scheduled for the first injection. Using her old military journalist credentials and connections she'd cultivated during her overseas tours, she'd orchestrated a paperwork shuffle that transferred Atlas out of the experimental program and into standard PTSD treatment. When his handler, Mike Torres, died, Margaret had personally arranged for Atlas to be retired from active duty and placed in the adoption program that eventually brought him to Bobby. She saved his life and his sanity, Eleanor said, watching as Atlas methodically patrolled the cabin's perimeter with the dedication of a professional security guard. But saving one dog wasn't enough for Margaret. She knew hundreds of others were still trapped in the program, and she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try to expose the whole operation. The laptop revealed Margaret's systematic documentation of the conspiracy. Financial records showed millions of dollars in black-budget funding being funneled to private contractors who conducted the experiments in facilities with no oversight. Email chains between military officials and pharmaceutical executives discussed test subjects like laboratory equipment rather than living beings who had served their country with honor and loyalty. Most damning were the video files Margaret had somehow obtained from inside the experimental facilities. Bobby could only watch fragments before the images became too disturbing. Dogs strapped to examination tables while technicians in hazmat suits injected unknown substances into their bloodstreams. Animals pacing in circles as the drugs destroyed their nervous systems. Handlers weeping as they were forced to authorize procedures that transformed their partners into monsters. The scope of the conspiracy reached higher than Bobby had imagined. Margaret's investigation had identified a network involving Pentagon officials, private defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and research institutions. The project had generated enormous profits while providing cover for testing drugs that would eventually be used on human soldiers, using military working dogs as unwilling test subjects for enhancement programs that violated every principle of medical ethics. Bobby's hands shook as he read Margaret's final report, a comprehensive expose that named names, provided documentation, and outlined a legal strategy for prosecuting the officials responsible. She had spent her last months building an airtight case that could have brought down dozens of high-ranking military officers and corporate executives, saving countless dogs and exposing a culture of corruption that treated loyal service members as disposable resources. The report was dated 3 days before Margaret's death, with a final note that chilled Bobby to his core. If something happens to me, the evidence must reach the press and congressional oversight committees. Atlas knows the location of additional documentation. Trust him completely. His life depends on completing this mission. Eleanor's revelations about Margaret's true identity created new layers of complexity in Bobby's understanding of his marriage. The woman he'd known as a quiet courthouse secretary had actually been a decorated military journalist who'd won commendations for exposing corruption in Iraq and Afghanistan. She'd witnessed the consequences of greed and incompetence firsthand, seeing soldiers die from defective equipment and inadequate supplies while contractors profited from human suffering. She retired from military journalism after witnessing a supply convoy get ambushed because someone sold defective armor to increase profit margins, Eleanor explained. Lost 3 friends that day, including a photographer she'd worked with for 2 years. Margaret came home broken, determined to live quietly and never again confront the darkness she'd seen in human nature. The courthouse job had been Margaret's attempt to find peace through routine bureaucracy, filing papers and answering phones in a world where the stakes never involved life and death. Her marriage to Bobby represented a conscious choice to embrace normalcy, to love someone who valued honesty and simplicity above ambition and profit. But Atlas's appearance in their lives had reawakened Margaret's sense of justice. When she discovered the dog's connection to Project Silent Guardian, she couldn't ignore the systematic abuse being inflicted on innocent animals who had served with the same loyalty and courage as any human soldier. The investigation that consumed her final months represented Margaret's return to her true calling, even knowing it might cost her the peaceful life she'd built with Bobby. The financial implications of Margaret's secret work became clear as Bobby discovered the extent of their medical debt. The cancer treatments had depleted their savings, but Margaret had also been spending money on investigative expenses, travel to interview witnesses, equipment to copy documents, legal fees for consultations about prosecution strategies. She'd sacrificed their financial security along with her health to build a case that could save lives and expose the truth. Atlas's behavior during this period of discovery revealed the depth of his training and intelligence. The dog seemed to understand that Bobby was learning about their shared connection to Margaret, responding to his emotional distress with the precision of a therapy animal while maintaining his protective vigilance over the sealed evidence. When Bobby broke down crying after reading particularly disturbing files, Atlas would position himself close enough to provide comfort while keeping his eyes focused on potential threats to their security. The cabin itself began to feel like a shrine to Margaret's sacrifice and determination. Bobby found evidence of her presence everywhere. A coffee mug with her lipstick still visible on the rim, notebooks filled with her careful handwriting, a sweater draped over a chair as if she'd just stepped outside for a moment. The scent of her perfume lingered in unexpected places, creating the haunting sensation that she might return at any moment to continue her work. Eleanor's daily visits provided both companionship and security briefings about potential threats. The elderly woman possessed an extensive network of contacts throughout the mountain community, people who'd agreed to watch for strangers asking questions about the cabin or its new owner. Her reports painted a picture of increasing surveillance. Rental cars with government plates parked on distant ridges, hikers with expensive equipment appearing on trails that rarely saw visitors, phone calls to local businesses inquiring about Bobby Mackenzie and his German Shepherd. "They know you're here," Eleanor warned during one particularly tense afternoon conversation. Margaret expected this. She said they'd eventually trace the investigation back to whoever inherited her work, but she believed you had the character and military experience to handle the pressure. The weight of expectation pressed down on Bobby's shoulders like a fully loaded rucksack during a forced march. Margaret had trusted him to complete a mission he'd never volunteered for, using skills he'd hoped never to need again, fighting an enemy that wore uniforms and held positions of authority. The irony wasn't lost on him. After surviving Vietnam by learning to distrust official orders and question authority, he now found himself fighting the same battles on his own soil. Atlas's unwavering loyalty provided both comfort and motivation. The dog's dedication to protecting Margaret's evidence demonstrated a level of commitment that transcended species barriers, proving that honor and duty weren't exclusively human virtues. When doubt crept into Bobby's mind during the darkest moments, Atlas's presence reminded him that some fights were worth the risk, some truths too important to remain buried. The sealed floorboards became a daily reminder of unfinished business, their perfect concealment a testament to Margaret's determination to preserve evidence at any cost. Bobby would sometimes catch himself staring at the hidden section, imagining Margaret's hands working with precision and purpose to create a time capsule that could survive long enough to serve justice. Every morning, Atlas would take his position beside the sealed area, a faithful guardian waiting for permission to reveal the secrets that could change everything. The confrontation Bobby had dreaded arrived on a crisp October morning when three black SUVs wound their way up the mountain road like predators stalking wounded prey. Atlas detected their approach long before Bobby heard the engines, the dog's entire body going rigid as his training kicked in with military precision. His low growl carried a warning that needed no translation. Danger was coming, and it wore the uniform of authority. Colonel Harrison Blackwood emerged from the lead vehicle with the bearing of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. At 68, he still carried himself like the career officer he'd been, his silver hair regulation short, and his expensive civilian clothes unable to disguise the ramrod posture of 3 decades in command. Behind him, 2 younger men in dark suits moved with the calculated awareness of private security contractors, their eyes scanning the cabin's perimeter with professional efficiency. Atlas positioned himself between Bobby and the approaching visitors, every muscle coiled for action, while his intelligent brown eyes tracked each movement. The dog's behavior had shifted into something Bobby recognized from Vietnam, the hyper-alert state that preceded combat, when survival depended on reading intentions and calculating threats in split-second intervals. "Mr. Mackenzie," Blackwood called out with the false friendliness of a politician soliciting votes. "Beautiful property you've got here. Mind if we have a conversation about your recent purchase?" Bobby stepped onto the porch, keeping one hand near the hunting rifle he'd positioned beside the door. 40 years of civilian life hadn't erased the instincts that had kept him alive in Southeast Asian jungles, and every alarm bell in his head was ringing with the intensity of incoming artillery. "Depends on what kind of conversation you're looking for," Bobby replied, his voice carrying the steady tone of a man who'd faced worse threats than expensive suits and government credentials. "Last I checked, this was private property, legally purchased at public auction." Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes as he approached the porch steps, his movements deliberately casual despite the tension radiating from Atlas like heat from a blast furnace. "I'm Colonel Harrison Blackwood, retired. I believe we have mutual interest regarding your unique situation here." The name hit Bobby like a physical blow as memories from Margaret's files flooded back. Colonel Blackwood had been one of the primary architects of Project Silent Guardian, his signature appearing on dozens of authorization documents that had condemned loyal military dogs to experimental torture. The man standing before him wasn't just a threat. He was one of the principal architects of the conspiracy Margaret had died trying to expose. "I know who you are," Bobby said quietly, watching as Blackwood's facade of friendliness cracked slightly around the edges. "Question is, what do you want with me? Direct. I appreciate that in a man." Blackwood gestured toward his companions who had positioned themselves strategically around the cabin's clearing. "I'm here to discuss a business proposition that could benefit us both. I understand you've recently come into possession of certain materials that might be better off in more experienced hands." Atlas's growl deepened to a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth designed for combat rather than companionship. The dog's reaction to Blackwood was visceral and immediate, recognition sparking in his eyes like flint striking steel. "Interesting dog you have there," Blackwood observed, his tone shifting subtly toward something harder and more calculating. "German Shepherd, military bearing. Looks familiar, actually. Reminds me of some animals I used to work with in my research programs." The casual mention of research programs sent ice water through Bobby's veins as he realized Blackwood was deliberately revealing his connection to Atlas's past. The colonel knew exactly which dog he was looking at, and his presence here wasn't coincidental. It was a targeted operation designed to retrieve evidence and eliminate witnesses. "Let's cut through the pleasantries," Blackwood continued, reaching into his jacket pocket with movements slow enough to avoid triggering defensive reactions. "I'm prepared to offer you $500,000 cash for this property and anything you might have discovered during your renovation efforts." The sum was staggering, more money than Bobby had ever imagined possessing, but the offer only confirmed the deadly importance of whatever Margaret had hidden beneath the floorboards. Men didn't casually offer $500,000 unless they were desperate to prevent exposure of crimes worth far more than money. "That's quite a generous offer for a run-down mountain cabin," Bobby replied, his hand drifting closer to the rifle. "Makes a man wonder what you think might be so valuable about this particular piece of property." Blackwood's mask of civility finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation of a career military officer accustomed to treating human lives as acceptable losses in service of larger objectives. "Your wife was a very thorough investigator, Mr. Mackenzie. Perhaps too thorough for her own good." Cancer is a terrible disease, but it's not the only way dedicated researchers can find their work terminated. The threat was delivered with surgical precision, designed to communicate exactly how Margaret had died while maintaining plausible deniability. Bobby felt rage building in his chest like pressure in a steam boiler, his vision narrowing as combat instincts he'd hoped never to use again surged through his bloodstream. Atlas sensed the escalating tension and moved closer to Bobby's side, the dog's training recognizing the moment when diplomacy would give way to violence. The German Shepherd's body language had shifted into attack mode, every line of his powerful frame communicating deadly intent to anyone with military experience. "Careful with your implications, Colonel," Bobby said, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that had preceded firefights in Vietnamese rice paddies. "Some accusations carry consequences that can't be taken back. I'm simply offering you a chance to avoid the same fate that befell your wife," Blackwood replied with the casual brutality of a man who'd authorized countless deaths with the stroke of a pen. Margaret thought she could expose practices that serve the greater good of national security. She discovered that some fights are too big for idealistic journalists with more courage than sense. The admission hung in the air like gun smoke, confirming what Bobby had suspected but hoped wasn't true. Margaret's death hadn't been a tragic coincidence. It had been a calculated execution disguised as natural disease, carried out by people who viewed her investigation as a threat to be eliminated rather than corruption to be corrected. Atlas's growl had become a continuous rumble of barely contained aggression, the dog's loyalty to Margaret's memory combining with his protective instincts toward Bobby to create an explosive mixture of canine fury. The German Shepherd understood the threat being made against his current handler, and his training told him that neutralizing threats was not just permitted but required. "Here's my counteroffer," Bobby said, reaching for the rifle with movements that telegraphed his intentions clearly enough to be understood by everyone present. "You and your friends get back in those vehicles and drive away. You never come back here, you never contact me again, and you pray that whatever evidence my wife gathered never sees the light of day." Blackwood's companions had drawn their weapons at the first sign of Bobby's movement, their training taking over as the situation devolved from negotiation into potential combat. The clearing around the cabin suddenly felt like a powder keg waiting for someone to strike a spark, with Atlas serving as the fuse that could ignite violence no one would be able to control. "That would be unwise," Blackwood said, his own hand moving toward a concealed weapon. "You're outnumbered, outgunned, and dealing with resources you don't understand. Accept my generous offer while it's still available." The standoff stretched across seconds that felt like hours. 4 armed men and 1 combat-trained dog balanced on the edge of violence, while mountains watched with ancient indifference. Bobby's finger found the rifle's trigger as muscle memory from Vietnam took control, his body settling into shooting positions he'd hoped never to use again. Atlas made the decision for everyone. With explosive speed that showcased years of military training, the German Shepherd launched himself toward the nearest security contractor, 80 pounds of muscle and fury moving with the precision of a guided weapon. The man's scream cut through the mountain air as canine teeth designed for subduing enemies found their target with devastating accuracy. Gunfire erupted across the clearing as training overcame thought and instinct replaced strategy. Bobby dove for cover behind the porch railing while return fire splintered wood around his head, the familiar chaos of combat flooding back with clarity that 4 decades hadn't dimmed. Atlas had taken down his target and was moving toward the second contractor with the fluid grace of a predator born for battle. Blackwood was shouting orders that no one could hear over the gunfire, his careful plan dissolving into the kind of uncontrolled violence that left bodies and questions in equal measure. The colonel had underestimated both Bobby's combat experience and Atlas's military training, assumptions that were proving fatal as his security team discovered the difference between intimidating civilians and fighting veterans. The battle lasted less than 3 minutes but felt like a lifetime, ending when Atlas's attack on the second contractor left Blackwood standing alone in a clearing littered with the consequences of his arrogance. The colonel's weapon trembled in his hands as he faced a Vietnam veteran and a military working dog who had both been pushed beyond the breaking point. "This doesn't end here," Blackwood gasped, blood streaming from wounds inflicted by Atlas during the melee. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, what larger purposes are served by necessary sacrifices." Bobby kept his rifle trained on the colonel while Atlas maintained a protective position, the dog's muzzle stained with evidence of his effectiveness as a weapon when circumstances required violence. It ends when justice is served and the truth comes out. Margaret died for that truth, and I'll be damned if her sacrifice was for nothing. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the mountain air, growing louder as local law enforcement responded to reports of gunfire in the usually peaceful valley. Eleanor's network of watchers had apparently included instructions to contact authorities if violence erupted at the cabin, ensuring that official witness would document whatever happened next. Blackwood's face went pale as he realized his carefully planned intimidation had become a public incident requiring explanations he couldn't provide. Bodies and witnesses meant investigations, and investigations meant exposure of the very secrets he'd come to protect. The tragedy that followed unfolded with the cruel precision of a Greek drama, each revelation cutting deeper into Bobby's soul until he felt hollowed out like a tree struck by lightning. Sheriff's deputies arrived to find 2 dead security contractors, a wounded Colonel Blackwood under Atlas's guard, and enough evidence scattered around the cabin to launch a federal investigation that would reach the highest levels of military command. But it was Eleanor's collapse that broke Bobby's heart completely. The 75-year-old woman had driven herself up the mountain road despite her weak heart, arriving just as the gunfire ended to find the clearing littered with bodies and her worst fears realized. The shock of seeing violence return to a place she'd hoped would finally know peace triggered a massive coronary that dropped her beside her car, clutching her chest while gasping Bobby's name. Atlas, still bloodied from the fight, immediately shifted from attack mode to medical response, his training recognizing a medical emergency requiring immediate action. The German shepherd's whines of distress as he paced around Eleanor's motionless form communicated what human words couldn't express. Another person he cared about was slipping away, and his protective instincts were powerless against the enemy of human mortality. "Call for an ambulance!" Bobby shouted to the arriving deputies, but even as he knelt beside Eleanor's still form, he could see the gray pallor of death creeping across her weathered features. Her eyes found his face with tremendous effort, lips moving soundlessly as she struggled to communicate something vital before time ran out. "Sarah," she whispered with her last breath, the name barely audible above the chaos of law enforcement securing the scene. "Tell Sarah I never stopped loving her." The paramedics worked frantically to revive Eleanor, their equipment and expertise insufficient to restart a heart that had finally surrendered to decades of grief and stress. Bobby watched helplessly as they covered her face with a white sheet, another casualty in a war that seemed determined to claim everyone he'd learned to care about. The interrogations that followed were brutal in their thoroughness. Federal agents descended on the mountain like locusts, transforming the peaceful cabin into a crime scene bristling with yellow tape and evidence markers. Bobby found himself answering the same questions repeatedly while Atlas was confined to a kennel pending evaluation of his actions during the firefight. "Your dog killed 2 federal contractors," Agent Patricia Mills informed Bobby during their third interview session. "Regardless of the circumstances, that's going to require extensive review by multiple agencies. There are procedures for dealing with dangerous animals." The word dangerous ignited fury in Bobby's chest. Atlas had been defending their lives against armed intruders who'd come with lethal intent, yet the bureaucracy was treating the German shepherd like a rabid animal that posed a public safety threat. The injustice was staggering. The dog who'd served his country faithfully was being punished for doing exactly what his training had taught him to do. Meanwhile, Colonel Blackwood was weaving a narrative that painted himself as the victim of an unprovoked attack by a deranged veteran and his unstable military dog. From his hospital bed, the colonel claimed he'd come to the cabin to offer legitimate assistance with Bobby's obvious PTSD issues, only to be attacked by a dangerous animal and its mentally unstable owner. The sealed floorboards were discovered and opened under federal supervision, revealing Margaret's carefully assembled evidence against Project Silent Guardian. The documentation was comprehensive and damaging, but Blackwood's legal team was already working to discredit the evidence as the paranoid fantasies of a dying woman whose cancer treatments had affected her mental stability. Mrs. Mackenzie was clearly suffering from chemotherapy-related cognitive impairment, Blackwood's attorney argued during preliminary hearings. These alleged documents represent the confused delusions of a terminally ill patient who'd developed paranoid fixations about imaginary government conspiracies. The character assassination of Margaret's memory proved more devastating to Bobby than any physical wound he'd endured in Vietnam. Watching lawyers tear apart his wife's reputation while defending the man responsible for her murder felt like being forced to watch her die again, helplessly witnessing the destruction of everything he'd held sacred. Atlas's confinement in the federal facility became a daily torment that made Bobby question everything he believed about justice and righteousness. The dog who'd saved his life and protected Margaret's evidence was being held like a criminal while his accusers walked free on bail. Visiting hours were limited and supervised, with Atlas growing more despondent each day as separation anxiety compounded his grief over Eleanor's death. "He's not eating regularly," the facility veterinarian reported during one of Bobby's visits. "Depression and stress are common in military working dogs when they're separated from their handlers. Without intervention, he could develop serious health complications." The irony was crushing. Atlas was dying from the same kind of institutional abandonment that Project Silent Guardian had inflicted on hundreds of other military dogs. The system that had trained him to be loyal was now punishing him for that loyalty, treating his devotion as evidence of dangerous unpredictability rather than admirable character. Public opinion began shifting as media coverage revealed the scope of Margaret's investigation and the nature of Blackwood's research programs. Veterans organizations rallied around Bobby and Atlas, recognizing the injustice of punishing a war hero for protecting his handler against corrupt officials who'd betrayed their oaths of service. But legal momentum was building against them. Federal prosecutors, influenced by military officials eager to contain the scandal, were preparing charges that could result in Atlas being euthanized as a dangerous animal, while Bobby faced decades in federal prison for assaulting government personnel. The truth of Margaret's investigation was being buried under procedural technicalities and jurisdictional disputes that favored institutional power over individual justice. And the breaking point came when Bobby received news that Atlas had stopped eating entirely and was showing signs of severe psychological distress. The German Shepherd's refusal to accept food or interact with handlers represented a form of passive suicide, the dog's way of expressing grief that transcended species boundaries. "He's grieving for everyone he's lost," the veterinarian explained with clinical detachment that couldn't mask genuine compassion. "First his original handler Mike Torres, then your wife Margaret, now Eleanor Hartwell, and separation from you. Military working dogs form intensely loyal bonds, and when those bonds are repeatedly severed, some animals simply lose the will to live." Bobby stood outside the federal facility that night, staring at the concrete walls that separated him from his last living connection to Margaret's memory. Atlas was dying of heartbreak, while bureaucrats debated whether his loyalty constituted evidence of mental instability. The dog who'd served his country faithfully, survived combat in Afghanistan, and risked his life to protect civilians was being destroyed by the very system he'd sworn to serve. The weight of accumulated loss pressed down on Bobby's shoulders like a physical burden. Margaret was gone, Eleanor was dead, and now Atlas was fading away in a government cage while the men responsible for their suffering prepared legal strategies to escape accountability. Every person and animal who'd shown him love or loyalty had been sacrificed to protect secrets that served no one except career politicians and defense contractors. In the darkness outside the facility, Bobby made a decision that would have horrified his younger self, but felt like the only honorable choice available to a man who'd lost everything worth protecting. If the system was determined to destroy Atlas for being loyal, then the system itself was the enemy. Margaret had died fighting institutional corruption, Eleanor had collapsed under the weight of buried truths, and now Atlas was facing execution for defending the people he loved. The time for playing by rules written by corrupt officials had ended. Bobby McKenzie, Vietnam veteran and widower, was about to become something he'd never imagined, a fugitive from the justice system he'd spent his life believing in, fighting to save the last living reminder of his wife's sacrifice. As he walked back to his truck, Bobby felt the ghost of Margaret's presence urging him forward. She'd given her life for truth and justice, and he wouldn't let her memory be dishonored by watching Atlas die in a government cage. Some fights were worth everything, and some loyalties transcended law when law itself became unjust. The war Margaret had started with a laptop and hidden evidence was about to become a different kind of battle, fought by a desperate man and his dying dog against an enemy that wore uniforms and hid behind badges while destroying everything decent and honorable in American society. The truth that shattered Bobby's world arrived not through dramatic revelation, but through a simple phone call at 3 a.m, when grief and exhaustion had stripped away his ability to process shock. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman he'd mourned for 3 years, speaking his name with the tenderness that had sustained him through 4 decades of marriage. "Bobby, it's me. It's Margaret." The words hit him like shrapnel, each syllable tearing through the fabric of reality he'd constructed around her death. His hands trembled as he gripped the phone, unable to trust his own hearing, while his heart hammered against his ribs with the force of resurrection hope and terror combined. "That's not possible," he whispered into the darkness of his motel room where he'd been hiding since breaking Atlas out of the federal facility 12 hours earlier. "Margaret's dead. I buried her. I held her hand while she died." "You held the hand of a woman who loved you enough to let you believe she was gone," Margaret's voice replied, carrying the familiar mixture of strength and gentleness that had anchored his world for so many years. "Eleanor helped me fake my death because it was the only way to keep you safe while I finished exposing Project Silent Guardian." The revelation struck Bobby with physical force, doubling him over as understanding crashed through his consciousness like a dam bursting under impossible pressure. Eleanor's final word hadn't been about a dead child named Sarah. It had been about Margaret, whose middle name was Sarah, a detail she'd shared with exactly 3 people in her lifetime. Atlas, lying motionless on the motel room's threadbare carpet, suddenly lifted his head and looked directly at the phone with an alertness Bobby hadn't seen since their escape from the facility. The German shepherd's ears perked forward as he recognized something in Margaret's voice that transcended human hearing, his tail moving in the tentative wag of a soldier who'd just received word that his commanding officer was alive. "Where are you?" Bobby's voice cracked with 3 years of accumulated grief and rage, his emotions cycling between overwhelming joy and devastating betrayal. "Where have you been while I've been dying inside, while Atlas has been grieving, while Eleanor sacrificed her life to protect your secrets?" Margaret's explanation unfolded like a military briefing, precise and comprehensive despite the emotional weight of every word. The cancer diagnosis had been real, but the experimental treatment program she'd entered had been a cover for witness protection rather than medical intervention. Eleanor, a former military intelligence officer herself, had coordinated the elaborate deception using connections from her own classified service during the Cold War. The people behind Project Silent Guardian had already killed 6 other investigators, Margaret explained, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years spent in hiding. "They were closing in on me, and we knew they'd eliminate you and Atlas to prevent any possibility of the truth emerging. Faking my death was the only way to protect you while giving me time to build an airtight case." The scope of the deception was staggering. Margaret's funeral had been real, except for the body in the coffin, which had contained the remains of an unclaimed vagrant donated by Eleanor's contacts in the medical examiner's office. The chemotherapy sessions Bobby had witnessed were genuine. Margaret had actually submitted to cancer treatment to maintain the illusion while simultaneously gathering evidence against the military conspiracy. Atlas had known the truth all along. His behavior at the cabin, his protective instincts, his refusal to grieve Margaret's death the way he'd mourned Mike Torres, all of it made sense now. The German shepherd's military training had included recognizing deception operations, and he'd understood that Margaret's absence was temporary rather than permanent. "He's been waiting for permission to reveal the secret," Margaret continued, her voice breaking with emotion as she listened to Atlas whining softly in the background. "Every day for 3 years, that dog has been protecting you while keeping faith that I'd return. His loyalty is absolute, Bobby. He never doubted I was coming back." The explanation of Eleanor's role was equally complex. The elderly woman had been Sarah Eleanor Blackwood, Colonel Blackwood's daughter, who'd transitioned to male identity as James before enlisting in the military. Eleanor had legally changed her name and gender back after James's death, using her grief and her father's guilt to position herself as a trusted insider with access to Project Silent Guardian's classified operations. Eleanor's heart attack had been triggered by the realization that her lifetime of careful planning was unraveling at the worst possible moment. She'd spent 8 years building evidence against her own father while maintaining the cover identity of a simple mountain widow, sacrificing her own emotional well-being to ensure that her child's death wouldn't be meaningless. "She loved you like the son she never had," Margaret explained, her voice thick with grief over Eleanor's death. "But she loved James more, and she couldn't live with knowing that her father had created the program that destroyed her child's mind and led to his death." The truth about Atlas's medical condition was the final piece of the devastating puzzle. The German Shepherd wasn't dying from grief or institutional abandonment. He was suffering from delayed effects of the experimental drugs he'd received before Margaret rescued him from Project Silent Guardian. The compounds designed to enhance aggression and eliminate fear responses had created neurological damage that was slowly killing him despite her efforts to find treatment. "He has maybe 6 months," Margaret said, her clinical tone unable to mask the pain of delivering another death sentence. "The experimental drugs are causing brain lesions that will eventually shut down his autonomous nervous system. Every day he's lived since leaving that program has been borrowed time." Bobby looked at Atlas with new understanding, seeing the occasional tremors and disorientation that he'd attributed to age and stress as symptoms of a much more serious condition. The dog who'd saved his life and protected Margaret's secrets was dying from the very experiments he'd been rescued from, his loyalty and service rewarded with a terminal illness that would claim him regardless of their success in exposing the truth. "Where are you?" Bobby asked again, his voice steadied by the need to see Margaret with his own eyes, to touch her face and confirm that she was real rather than a grief-induced hallucination brought on by exhaustion and desperation. 2 miles away in a cabin Eleanor prepared for this moment," Margaret replied. She knew that eventually the truth would come out and we'd need a place to meet safely. "I've been watching you and Atlas for 3 years, Bobby, staying close enough to protect you but far enough away to maintain the illusion." The drive to the rendezvous point took only minutes, but felt like crossing decades of accumulated grief and anger. Atlas rode in the passenger seat with alert attention, his behavior transformed from depressed resignation to eager anticipation as familiar scents grew stronger through the truck's open windows. The cabin Margaret emerged from was smaller than their mountain hideaway, a hunter's shack tucked into dense woods that provided perfect concealment from surveillance. She appeared in the doorway like a ghost made flesh, her hair gray now instead of brown, but her smile unchanged despite 3 years of separation and deception. Atlas launched himself from the truck before Bobby had fully stopped, 80 pounds of German Shepherd crossing the distance in bounds that defied his medical condition. Margaret dropped to her knees to receive the dog's ecstatic greeting, tears streaming down her face as Atlas covered her with kisses and whines of pure joy that echoed through the forest. Bobby approached more slowly, his emotions too complex for immediate expression as he studied the woman he'd buried and mourned. Margaret looked older, thinner, marked by the stress of maintaining her deception while building a case against some of the most powerful people in military leadership. But her eyes held the same love and determination that had sustained their marriage through 4 decades of challenges and changes. "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered as Bobby finally reached her, her arms wrapping around him with desperate intensity while Atlas pressed against both of them as if physical contact could prevent another separation. "I'm sorry for the pain, for the loneliness, for letting you believe I was gone. But it was the only way to keep you alive long enough to finish what we started." Bobby held his wife while their dog danced around them with joy, his anger and grief temporarily overwhelmed by relief that felt like salvation. Margaret was alive. Atlas was ecstatic. And for the first time in 3 years, the world felt complete despite the terminal diagnosis hanging over them like a sword. The evidence we gathered is comprehensive enough to bring down everyone involved in Project Silent Guardian, Margaret explained as they sat together in the cabin's simple interior. Congressional hearings are already scheduled, media outlets are preparing coordinated releases, and veteran organizations are mobilizing support for the affected animals and their handlers. The legal case she'd built during her 3 years in hiding was devastating in its scope and precision. Financial records showed millions of dollars in illegal payments, video evidence documented systematic animal abuse, and recorded conversations revealed the casual brutality with which military officials had discussed destroying loyal service animals for profit and personal advancement. Colonel Blackwood's arrest was imminent, along with dozens of other military officers and defense contractors who'd profited from the systematic abuse of animals who'd served their country faithfully. The scandal would reach into the highest levels of Pentagon leadership, exposing a culture of corruption that treated loyal soldiers as disposable resources in service of career advancement and corporate profits. But even justice couldn't heal the deepest wounds or restore the time they'd lost. Atlas was still dying. Eleanor was still dead. And 3 years of separation had changed all of them in ways that couldn't be undone by reunion or legal vindication. "We can't get back the time we lost," Margaret said quietly, her hand stroking Atlas's head as the German shepherd finally settled beside them with the contentment of a soldier whose mission was complete. "But we can make sure the time we have left counts for something." Atlas deserves to spend his final months knowing he's loved and honored, not caged like a criminal or euthanized like a threat. The reunion was real, but it was also temporary, a brief respite before the final phase of a battle that had already cost them more than victory could ever restore. The final months of Atlas's life unfolded with the bittersweet beauty of autumn leaves falling, each day precious precisely because it was numbered, each moment weighted with the knowledge that soon there would be no more. Bobby and Margaret had moved to a small farm in rural Tennessee, far from the media circus surrounding the Project Silent Guardian trials, where Atlas could spend his remaining time running through open fields instead of lying on sterile examination tables. The German shepherd had rallied remarkably after the reunion, his joy at having his pack complete again temporarily overwhelming the neurological damage that was slowly claiming his motor functions. He followed Margaret everywhere during her morning walks, sat beside Bobby during evening conversations on the porch, and seemed determined to soak up every available moment of the love and attention he'd been denied during 3 years of separation and secrecy. Congressional hearings had vindicated Margaret's investigation completely, with Colonel Blackwood and 43 other military officials facing criminal charges that would likely result in life sentences. The Project Silent Guardian scandal had become the largest military corruption case in decades, with media coverage exposing systematic abuse that shocked even veterans accustomed to institutional failures. But legal victory felt hollow when weighed against the personal costs. Atlas's seizures were becoming more frequent despite aggressive medical treatment, his coordination declining as brain lesions interfered with basic neurological functions. The veterinary neurologist had been brutally honest about the progression. Within weeks, Atlas would lose the ability to walk, then to eat, then to recognize the people he loved. "We have a choice to make soon," Margaret said quietly during one of their evening conversations, watching Atlas sleep fitfully beside the fireplace. "We can let the disease take him slowly, or we can give him the dignity of choosing his own moment while he's still himself." Bobby had been dreading this conversation for weeks, even as Atlas's decline made the decision increasingly inevitable. The dog who'd survived combat in Afghanistan and protected them through years of danger deserved better than a prolonged deterioration that would strip away everything that made him the magnificent animal they'd both loved. Atlas seemed to understand the discussions taking place around him, his intelligent eyes following conversations with the awareness of a soldier who recognized when strategic decisions were being made. During his better moments, he would approach Bobby and Margaret with a calm acceptance that spoke of military training that included understanding when missions reached their natural conclusion. The investigation had also revealed the full scope of Atlas's service record, including commendations Bobby had never known existed. The German Shepherd had saved 17 soldiers during his deployment in Afghanistan, detected 37 explosive devices, and participated in countless patrols that had prevented American casualties. His service jacket read like a summary of heroism that put most human military records to shame. Margaret had been working with veterans organizations to establish a memorial foundation honoring military working dogs who'd been victimized by Project Silent Guardian. The Atlas Foundation would provide medical care for affected animals while lobbying for stronger protections against the kind of institutional abuse that had claimed so many lives. "He's going to live on in every dog we save," Margaret explained to Bobby as they reviewed Foundation documents. "His suffering won't be meaningless if we can prevent it from happening to others." Atlas's final good day arrived in late November, with golden sunlight streaming through bare tree branches and temperatures warm enough for extended outdoor activity. The German Shepherd had awakened with unusual energy. His neurological symptoms temporarily subsided enough to allow one last adventure with the people he'd protected and loved. They drove to the original mountain cabin where their journey had begun, now restored to its intended purpose as a peaceful retreat rather than a repository for dark secrets. Atlas explored the property with obvious joy, sniffing familiar scents and marking territories he remembered from their brief time there together. The sealed floorboards had been replaced with honest oak planks, and sunlight streamed through windows that were finally clean. Margaret had transformed the space into a memorial room honoring the victims of Project Silent Guardian, with photographs and service records of dozens of military dogs who died in the experimental program. Atlas studied each photograph with the attention of a soldier reviewing fallen comrades, his behavior suggesting recognition of animals he'd known during his own military service. When he reached Mike Torres's photograph, his original handler killed in Afghanistan, Atlas placed his paw against the glass and whined softly, a sound that carried years of grief and loyalty. "He's saying goodbye," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched Atlas complete what appeared to be a deliberate ritual of remembrance. "He's telling them he kept faith, that he completed his mission." Bobby knelt beside Atlas and placed his hand on the dog's powerful shoulders, feeling the tremors that indicated advancing neurological damage, despite the German Shepherd's determination to remain strong. "You did good, boy. You did everything right, and we're proud of you." As afternoon faded into evening, they sat together on the cabin's porch where their story had begun with a 25-cent purchase and a German Shepherd's protective instincts. Atlas lay between Bobby and Margaret, his breathing labored but peaceful, his eyes alert despite the disease claiming his nervous system. "Tomorrow?" Margaret asked quietly, the single word carrying the weight of a decision that would end Atlas's suffering while honoring his dignity as a warrior who'd served with distinction. Bobby nodded, unable to trust his voice as grief overwhelmed his ability to speak. Atlas seemed to understand, his tail moving in a weak wag that communicated acceptance rather than fear. The German Shepherd, who'd faced enemy fire without flinching, was approaching his final battle with the same courage that had defined his entire life. "Doctor," Sarah Chen arrived at sunrise, her mobile veterinary practice specializing in end-of-life care for military working dogs whose service had earned them the right to die surrounded by love rather than sterile medical facilities. She'd treated dozens of Project Silent Guardian victims, understanding the unique bond between handlers and dogs who'd served together in combat zones. Atlas was lying in his favorite spot in the morning sunlight, his head resting across Bobby's lap while Margaret stroked his ears with the gentleness she'd shown throughout their reunion. The German Shepherd's breathing was shallow but peaceful, his eyes clear and focused on the faces of the people who'd become his pack after military service ended. "He's ready," Dr. Chen said softly, preparing the injection that would allow Atlas to slip away without pain or fear. "He knows he's loved, and he knows his mission is complete. That's all any soldier can ask for." The sedative took effect slowly, Atlas's powerful body relaxing as neurological damage that had caused months of suffering finally ceased to matter. His eyes remained open, fixed on Bobby's face with the trust and loyalty that had defined their relationship from the first day they'd met at the military adoption center. "Thank you for everything," Bobby whispered, his voice breaking as Atlas's breathing became shallower and more irregular. "Thank you for protecting Margaret, for protecting me, for being the best soldier and the best friend anyone could ask for." Atlas's tail moved one final time, a gesture so slight it might have been involuntary except for the timing that suggested conscious communication. His eyes held Bobby's gaze until the very end, maintaining the connection between handler and dog that had sustained them both through years of danger and grief. The moment of death was peaceful, unmarked by struggle or distress. Atlas simply stopped breathing, his powerful body finally at rest after years of service and sacrifice. Margaret and Bobby held him as he passed, their tears falling onto fur that had been scarred by combat but remained magnificent in its strength and beauty. They buried Atlas in the meadow behind the cabin, under an oak tree that would shade his grave through changing seasons. His headstone was simple but complete. Atlas, military working dog, faithful soldier, loyal friend, true hero. His mission is complete. The Atlas Foundation was officially launched 1 month later, with congressional funding and support from veterans organizations across the country. Margaret's investigation had not only exposed systematic corruption, but had also created momentum for comprehensive reforms protecting military working dogs from experimental abuse. Bobby stood at Atlas's grave on Christmas morning, placing a wreath made from mountain laurel beside the headstone while snow began to fall across the meadow. Margaret was inside preparing breakfast, their first Christmas together in 4 years made possible by Atlas's sacrifice and Eleanor's courage. "Merry Christmas, boy," Bobby whispered to the granite marker that bore Atlas's name and service record. "I hope wherever you are, you're running free with Mike and Eleanor, and you know how much you meant to all of us." A cardinal landed on the headstone, its red feathers bright against the gray stone and white snow. The bird remained motionless for several minutes, as if paying its own respects to a warrior who'd earned recognition from all living creatures. Bobby walked back toward the cabin, where Margaret was visible through the kitchen window, her silver hair catching morning light as she moved with the grace that had attracted him 47 years earlier. Atlas had brought them back together, protected their love through separation and deception, and given them the gift of time to heal from wounds that had seemed mortal. The 25 cents that had started their journey now sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, beside photographs of Atlas, Eleanor, and Margaret during happier times. It represented the best investment Bobby had ever made, not in property or possessions, but in trust, loyalty, and the kind of love that transcends species and survives even death. Outside, snow continued to fall on the meadow where a hero slept peacefully at last, his mission finally and completely accomplished. The years that followed Atlas's death brought Bobby and Margaret a peace they'd never imagined possible, built on foundations of truth, forgiveness, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and loss together. Their small Tennessee farm became a sanctuary not just for them, but for retired military working dogs whose handlers had been killed in action or whose medical needs exceeded standard veteran care programs. The Atlas Foundation had grown beyond their wildest expectations, with congressional funding enabling the rescue and rehabilitation of over 300 military dogs affected by experimental programs or abandoned by institutional failures. Margaret's investigative work had sparked comprehensive reforms in military animal care, while Bobby's experience as a handler provided practical guidance for matching retired dogs with veteran families who understood the unique needs of warriors transitioning to civilian life. Their morning routine had evolved into a ritual of gratitude that honored both their survival and their losses. Bobby would wake before dawn to tend to the 6 retired military dogs currently living on their property, each animal representing a life saved and a handler honored. Margaret would prepare breakfast for their extended household, which now included 2 other veteran couples who'd found healing through caring for damaged animals who understood trauma from personal experience. The kitchen table conversations had become legendary among their network of military families, with Margaret's investigative instincts and Bobby's practical experience creating a forum where veterans could discuss their struggles without judgment or false patriotic platitudes. These breakfast discussions had evolved into an informal support network that stretched across 3 states, connecting handlers with resources and animals with families who could provide appropriate care. Atlas's grave had become a pilgrimage site for military dog handlers from across the country, veterans who'd traveled hundreds of miles to pay respects to a German shepherd whose story had exposed systematic corruption while demonstrating the loyalty and courage that defined the best of military service. The headstone was frequently decorated with flowers, dog tags, and handwritten notes from people whose own animals had been saved by reforms Atlas's sacrifice had made possible. Bobby's relationship with Margaret had been transformed by their shared ordeal, moving beyond the comfortable familiarity of long marriage into something deeper and more conscious. The 3 years of separation had taught them both that love required active choice rather than passive assumption, that protecting someone sometimes meant making sacrifices that felt like betrayal in service of larger truths. "We're different people than we were before," Margaret observed during one of their evening walks through the meadow where Atlas rested. "The cancer, the deception, losing Eleanor, watching Atlas die, all of it changed us in ways we're still discovering." Bobby agreed, though he struggled to articulate the transformation he felt in his own character. The man who'd bought a cabin for 25 cents had been driven by grief and nostalgia, seeking to honor a dead wife's dreams through symbolic gestures that couldn't restore what had been lost. The man he'd become understood that honor wasn't about preserving the past, but about creating a future worthy of the sacrifices that had made it possible. Their work with the foundation had introduced them to stories that put their own suffering in perspective while reinforcing the importance of what they'd accomplished. Military dogs who'd been abandoned by the system were finding homes with families who understood that behavioral problems often reflected untreated trauma rather than inherent aggression. Handlers who'd lost their canine partners were discovering that caring for other animals could provide healing without diminishing their grief for specific losses. The congressional hearings had concluded with comprehensive legislation protecting military working dogs from experimental abuse while providing funding for lifetime medical care and retirement programs. Colonel Blackwood had died in federal prison before serving a full year of his sentence, his health failing under the weight of disgrace and isolation from the military community that had defined his identity for 4 decades. Eleanor's legacy had been honored through the creation of a scholarship program for veterans transitioning from military to civilian careers, with particular emphasis on supporting individuals who'd served as whistleblowers or investigative journalists exposing institutional corruption. Margaret had endowed the Eleanor Hartwell Memorial Fund with proceeds from her book about Project Silent Guardian, ensuring that courage in service of truth would be recognized and supported. The cabin on the mountain had been converted into a retreat center for military families dealing with PTSD and service-connected disabilities. The space where Atlas had found Margaret's evidence now housed a library of resources about veteran mental health, while the meadow where he'd played during his final weeks had become a memorial garden honoring all military working dogs who died in service to their country. Bobby's understanding of patriotism had evolved through their experience, moving from reflexive respect for authority toward a more complex appreciation of the difference between supporting institutions and supporting the values those institutions were supposed to represent. True patriotism, he'd learned, sometimes required opposing official policies in service of principles that transcended political expedience or career advancement. Margaret's health had stabilized after years of stress-related complications, though she still struggled with survivor guilt about the people who'd died protecting her investigation. Therapy had helped her understand that Eleanor's choice to sacrifice her life for truth had been conscious and voluntary, not the result of Margaret's manipulation or coercion. The elderly woman had found purpose in using her final years to expose the corruption that had destroyed her child, transforming personal grief into public service. Their relationship with the military community had been complicated by their role in exposing institutional failures, with some veterans viewing them as traitors who'd provided ammunition to critics of American defense policies. But the majority of service members they encountered expressed gratitude for reforms that protected both human and canine personnel from the kind of systematic abuse that had flourished in classified programs with minimal oversight. The 25 cents that had started their journey occupied a place of honor in their home, mounted in a simple frame beside photographs of Atlas, Eleanor, and the hundreds of military dogs whose lives had been improved by reforms inspired by their story. The coin represented more than the cost of a property purchase. It symbolized the price of courage, the value of persistence, and the return on investments made in love rather than profit. Their evening routine now included reading letters from military families who'd been reunited with retired working dogs through the Atlas Foundation's matching program. Each success story reinforced the meaning of their own losses while demonstrating that personal tragedy could be transformed into public benefit when survivors chose service over bitterness. Bobby had begun speaking at veterans events about the importance of advocating for animal welfare within military culture, sharing stories that honored Atlas's memory while encouraging current service members to report abuse or neglect they witnessed in training or deployment situations. His presentations always concluded with the same message: loyalty flows both ways, and humans owe the same faithfulness to animals that those animals demonstrate toward their human partners. Margaret continued her investigative work on a smaller scale, focusing on exposing fraud in veteran healthcare and disability programs, rather than taking on massive institutional conspiracies that required years of undercover research. Her experience with Project Silent Guardian had taught her that sustainable reform required building coalitions rather than conducting solo investigations that put individuals at excessive personal risk. As they approached their 70th birthdays, both Bobby and Margaret found themselves reflecting on the unexpected directions their lives had taken from that morning when Atlas had growled at a mountain cabin that seemed too cheap to be legitimate. The journey from grief and loss to purpose and fulfillment had been neither straight nor easy, but it had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded heroism and love provided motivation. The farm where Atlas had spent his final months had become a symbol of redemption that attracted visitors from across the country, veterans and civilians alike who found inspiration in a story that demonstrated the possibility of transforming personal tragedy into public service. The German shepherd who'd died protecting secrets that saved other animals had become a legend within military communities that honored courage over conformity and truth over convenience. Their love story, interrupted by deception, tested by separation, and ultimately strengthened by shared purpose, had become a testament to the resilience of commitment that chooses service over self-interest. They'd learned that marriage wasn't just about personal happiness, but about building partnerships capable of confronting injustice and creating positive change in a world that often rewarded cynicism over idealism. On quiet evenings when Tennessee's rolling hills were painted gold by sunset, Bobby and Margaret would sit together on their porch, surrounded by sleeping dogs who'd found peace after years of service and trauma. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with shared understanding of how much they'd survived and accomplished together. 25 cents had bought them more than property. It had purchased wisdom, purpose, and a love that had proven stronger than deception, deeper than grief, and more valuable than any treasure they could have imagined when their journey began with a simple bid at a government auction where no one else had dared to raise their hand. Message to American seniors, 200 words. Sometimes the smallest investments yield the greatest returns, not in money, but in meaning. Bobby's 25 cents didn't just buy property, it purchased a chance to honor love, protect the innocent, and transform personal loss into lasting change. Like many of us who've served our country and raised our families, Bobby discovered that life's second chapter can be its most meaningful when we choose courage over comfort. Margaret's sacrifice, Atlas's loyalty, and Eleanor's wisdom remind us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the lives we touch and the truths we're brave enough to defend. Their story proves that ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances can create ripples of positive change that extend far beyond our own lifetimes. Every veteran who's lost a brother in arms, every spouse who's faced the unthinkable, every senior who feels forgotten by the system they once served, your story matters, your experience has value, and your capacity for making a difference doesn't diminish with age. It grows stronger through wisdom earned by surviving life's hardest battles. Questions for engagement. What's the smallest investment or decision that ended up changing your entire life's direction? How has your understanding of loyalty and service evolved as you've gotten older? And what would you want younger generations to know about true patriotism? Please share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Your experiences matter and deserve to be heard.